Exertus.
Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarians.
Recent Tartarians. Recent Tartarians.
Join us on another exciting adventure of Exertus.
There were so many Prussian inventors that invented so many things, let alone aviation. Inventing all kinds of crazy things, from flying machines to things much more intense, like the metric tensor torsion field, which is, in differential geometry, the notion of torsion, and a manner of characterizing a twist or screw of a moving frame around a curve. The torsion of a curve, as it appears in the Freyre formulas, for instance, quantify the twist of a curve about its tangent vector as the curve evolves, or rather the rotation of the Freyre frame about the tangent vector evolves in the geometry of the surfaces. The geodesic torsion describes how a surface twists about a curve on the surface. The companion notion of a curvature measures how moving frames roll along a curve without twisting. More generally, on a differentiable manifold equipped with that's a connection in the tangent bundle. Torsion and curvature form the two fundamental invariants of the connection. In this context, the torsion gives an intrinsic characterization of how tangent space twists about a curve when they're parallel transported. Whereas curvature describes how the tangent space rolls along the curve, torsion may be described concretely as a tensor or as a vector, valued to form on the manifold. Like if delta is an affine connection on a differential manifold, then there's a torsion tension defined in terms of the vector field x and y, by where the geometric coordinates of xy is the line brackets of vector field in differential geometry. So in a vector of up and down, the notion of torsion is a manner of characterization and is a manner of characterizing that twist. And that's a pretty old concept, but it's a relatively new school of thought. A twist torsion curved spacetime is really just a way of looking at the analog range between the binary of separation and connection, and in that identity of union, measuring that analog, scaling that analog through a metric, defined as the tensing and loosening of that torsion field. This stuff used to be beyond the capacity of physicists to understand, because it just didn't play well with the obsolete metrics of the 20th century. But as we move out of the particle wave dynamic and we start to learn about particle wave physics more, seeing that particles are intrinsically linked to waves, and that really the most important thing is this concept of torsion, then we do away with a lot of false rhetoric, and then we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater as much. Gravity pretty much doesn't exist, I think we all know that, but non-gravity seems an inescapable concept. There is something, and we seem to be able to refer to it more and more as a wave. And this makes a lot more sense when we're dealing with the fractal quality of a causal, non-causal universe. One where decisions can be made which affect the course of your life, and yet seemingly other times realities simply converge. This idea is not new. Like I've said, this idea is not new. It's actually super ancient. And some of the best information we have, besides the scientific articles that have come out in the last couple of years, are centuries, perhaps millennia old records of the HOPI, the LAKOTA, the Yukon, the Occidental Pagans, who not only have stories about these times when we interacted with light beings and extraterrestrials, but also a completely different cosmology and way of looking at the Earth that's united by all the peoples of the Earth except for by the people that run it today. Stories by the natives of America, of Africa, of Europe and Asia. And a lot of these stories I think you would take more seriously if they had medieval paintings associated with them. But it seems like a lot of people were just living their lives in the ancient world, and they were doing their best to illustrate these points with a certain level of surreality and abstracts. Kokopeli, for instance, a deity of music across the Southwest in the Native Americas, recognized by several Native American tribes. The character seems to be holding a flute and have dreadlocks or some sort of wild hair. However, The earliest pictures of Kokopeli illustrate that this is not a musical instrument, but in fact the mandible of his insectoid anthropomorphic body, which he uses to, like a mosquito, slurp his nourishment out of a straw. And this insect-like god, Kokopeli, circulates during the times of malaria and flu season, and is associated with hysteria, sickness, festivals, and procreation. But there is a disease-spreading side as well. In some of the cryptozoology that relates to the ancient occult and anthropological mythologies of these native peoples feels just a little bit sci-fi. And as weird as the stuff I try to talk about, I usually try to steer clear of the stuff that isn't historical observations and experiments. I mean, don't get me wrong, I want to believe. I'm open to the seemingly infinite possibilities of the multiverse. But that's not even what X-Files talks about, right? I mean, the whole point of X-Files is there are crazy, unexplained phenomena that people think are aliens, and then they go and find out that it was actually some sort of a corporation or government program. And then the FBI have to act as a sort of cleanup crew to find out what was going on. Area 51 seems to be on everybody's mind today because Area 51 is the name brand site. I mean, if everyone's heard about it, don't you think they're gonna move their cool stuff elsewhere? Not to say that there isn't cool stuff there. Underground caverns, the sparse population makes it possible for them to conduct their weird war game plans and flying around all the time with experimental crafts. And experimental advanced aerial crafts fly all over New Mexico and Arizona. You probably really don't need to be right inside of the sites in order to see some cool stuff. Just get some binoculars and hang out in a van on a hill somewhere. Sites around Roswell, like S4, renowned for the experimental crafts which have been worked on there. Though S4 is mostly still a secret, there have been a lot of pictures that have shown the 666th quadrant and the 554th, all the way from Gold Flat to Site 4, which is connected by a geothermal power plant to a site called the Fly Trap. It's a giant cave tunnel that leads into the side of a mountain. There's a number of tunnels and cave bases around this mountain. I've seen a few myself when I was in New Mexico. Now, this is the part of the story that seems the weirdest, but hear me out. Believe whatever you want because I don't have any pictures of this part. What I remember seeing a few years ago, just on the other side of a base mountain, where planes were flying into the mountain, literally into the side of the mountain. It makes sense when during the day in different places you can see some of these tunnels if you're in the right tops of mountains, but it's become more and more difficult to spot because they're using projection camouflage. I'm not talking about Harry Potter's invisibility cloak. This is just simple stuff using mist, dust, and lasers. The kind of stuff that you use at Disneyland, you can project right on water or dust. In the night, it's particularly easy. In a dark cave, from a rear projection, this would be easy to do too in the middle of broad daylight. Just aim a projector at a mist, which can be generated with water and with dust with a fan. If I had a laser projector, I'm pretty sure I could take over countries with it. These magical camouflage projections work in mysterious ways, not only to give you the woo, ooh, and ah with special effects and magical scenes, but also to hide, making it possible to project footage of dust right on top of the dust, and with automated location technology making it possible to fly a plane right into a tunnel like a glove. All of this technology has been talked about by a number of other people. More of it than not has been disclosed to the public, especially over the last 20 years. A guy who gets a lot of flack is Bob Lazar. I have some friends who think he's incredible, others that think he's a shill. But for whatever you think of Bob Lazar, who he is, really a nerd from New Mexico, who claims to have worked for a government experimental research facility for aviation, and saw stuff that he can't account for, and he suggests that this technology was recovered, though not by ancient Tartarians, but instead by extraterrestrials. In his rocket club, he was able to convert a rocket-powered Honda CRX. But he was all over the newspapers, which is one of the ways it was hard for them to fully disappear him when they deleted his records for working at the base. A rather sloppy job that kind of points out that he did work for them because it seems like they just deleted his whole life file. Like even his elementary school paperwork, his teachers signed off on. Everything was just deleted. I mean, that's just too clean of a fingerprint removal. Clearly he's eccentric and had his own personal life, which he was interested in doing all sorts of unconventional things. Maybe they thought he was the kind of outsider that they needed to make this work. I can kind of buy that. Granted, I have a weird backstory myself. A lot of the reason that I've been allowed to be part of things was because I'm pretty outside of the box, admittedly. And also I can see how they might have thought that Bob Lazar was not enough of a patron to always toe the party line. But I mean, if your only problem with the Bob Lazar story is the aliens, then you can leave that go. It's more about whether or not he worked in this experimental research facility where he saw technology that didn't belong to our current civilization and was being reverse engineered, wherever it came from. Futuristic, extraterrestrial, ancient, and whether or not you believe that crazy things are possible and that weird stuff happens and that crazy people are possible of amazing things. I gotta tell you, crazy things are possible and humans are amazing. Needless to say, I find some of the important parts of the story accurate, at least enough to have brought it up. And more interesting than extraterrestrials is the physics itself. Like, start looking into some of the stuff he talks about. He's way more interested in physics and engineering and entropy than his own conjecture about flying little people. I mean, even he thinks that's kind of crazy and wishes he wasn't thinking about it. But he was basically one of the first Americans to disclose the idea of the non-gravity wave. And in a lot of ways, he was talking about stuff in the 80s that I only started working on in 2015, 2016, like electromagnetic quantum dots for figuring out how you could use simultaneous variable holographic polarities. And I'm going to go ahead and say patent pending trademark on that. In order to navigate a substrate's electromagnetic frequencies simultaneously in a holographic array, making it possible to zero in on different frequencies for electromagnetic propulsion and polarity, so that it could rise and sink, move forward, backwards, left and right on XYZ coordinates freely and simultaneously. In other words, a sort of fifth element multipass. And I got this idea from 3rd grade when my grandfather and I built an ionic lifter together. Anybody should just build one of these because they're phenomenal. But basically it's a pool rack that has a copper tether, which you ground and connect to an electric charge. The increase of electric charge increases the magnetism, and this principle of electromagnetism forces the ions to flow with polarity down the sides of the craft, down the sides of the substrate, repelling the substrate away from the ions, causing lift. In other words, a flying saucer. But yeah, I gotta wonder about what other kinds of things that they were doing at Lockheed. This is the kind of fun project he was gonna do with his grandson. Anyway, this fun project gave me the idea years later because of chemical vapor deposition of sputtering. Sputtering is basically what happens when you take your toothbrush and you flick the head of the bristles so that it splatters all over your mirror, getting this thin spray of dots of material across the substrate. It's the same technology which is used in filmmaking, where 7 layers of perforated photoreactive chemical solvents are sputtered on top of each other with the resolution of tens of millions of crystals per inch. And this technology has been further developed to produce quantum dots, where items can be smaller than 10,000 angstroms, literally within the size of tens of atoms. These quantum dots can be stacked in between each other. They can be so tightly knit, such as seen here, that the room between the dots is actually smaller than the size of a water droplet. In other words, this material could not get wet. Water would simply run off the top of it, rolling between the heads of these cones. Here at an even smaller scale, looking through a scanning electron microscope, at about 150 to 200 nanometers per each square, you can see where some of these quantum dots are about 10 to 20 nanometers. Freaking small. Going even further out, away from quantum dots and just using variable quantum size materials, one of my specialties is exfoliated electrostatic graphene. And you can see how this has a lot of the features of quantum dots. It's just slightly cooler. Scarier, but it's definitely cooler. The stuff you can do with exfoliated nanoplatelets in terms of electrostatic charge really makes this stuff crazy. I mean, it can zap materials, it can magnetize materials, it can repel materials in novel ways that quantum dots simply can't yet. And this stuff's really easy to make, but I'm not going to tell you how. Maybe I'll make a video about that someday. As even today, not many labs are producing this stuff. I'm going to keep that secret in mind.
Where is this airing right now? Or is this?
Recent
This
talk
program is coming
Terrians.
to you via Relay 2 satellite, a spacecraft orbiting the Earth at a speed of over 17,000 miles per hour.
Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarians.
Recent talk Terrians.
Excertus.